Annenberg Media.
Additional funding was provided by this and other public television stations and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Down the gallery of Africa's colonial history, Algeria occupies a special place. The Museum of the Revolution in Algiers tells the story of more than 100 years of resistance, dating back to the arrival of French conquerors in 1830. So began a history of new conflicts in Africa, which still rack the continent today, Africa and its traditions resisting modern imperialism. There are occasions when tradition is in fact progressive and modernity is reactionary. Here's Abdul Qadir, a religious nationalist of Algeria in the 19th century, engaged in resistance against the French. Now, you and I know that France is, as it were, the mother of all modern revolutions, revolutions which believe that men are not gods, are in control of human destiny. You can't be much more modern than that. In fact, Karl Marx and Engels actually applauded French colonialism in Algeria because they felt that modernized France was a progressive force for Algeria. But within Algeria itself, a different story was unfolding. The torch of resistance was being passed from generation to generation, from Abdul Qadir in the 19th century to the National Liberation Front in 1954, in the outbreak of the war against France. This program is about conflicts from Algeria to South Africa. It's about confrontations caused by Africa's cultural mix of indigenous, Islamic, and Western forces. Islam created religious divisions in Africa. Westernization created borders between colonies and barriers between races. And Africa was struggling to reclaim its own. Land has always been at the center of the conflict between whites and blacks, and nowhere was the confrontation more acute than in colonial Kenya. Using the gun where necessary, white settlers reserved for themselves some 30% of the most fertile land in Kenya. This paradise was known as the White Highlands. Most of the previous occupants, the Kikuyu, were shunted off into tribal reserves, Kenya's own apartheid. Some were allowed to stay as squatters in exchange for labor. By the 1950s, the native areas were overcrowded. As the locals looked across the fence at the white tribal reserves, their anger finally erupted into war.
troops are in the streets of Nairobi. Sir Evelyn Baring, the governor, salutes the men of the Lancashire Fusiliers who have flown in to help clear his colony of the Mau Mau menace, which has struck fear into Kenya's very heart. Europeans and Africans walk the streets in fear of the dreaded Mau Mau. For it is that band of fanatics whose bloody deeds have cast a dark shadow across the face of Kenya.
Britain responded with terrifying brutality. Lincoln bombers set the forests of Kenya on fire in a bid to destroy the nationalists in hiding. The British Empire was engaged in one of its last orgies of militarized righteousness. If Algerian nationalists combined Islam with patriotism, the Mau Mau in their forest hideout fused indigenous religion with nationalism. An important feature of Mau Mau's recruiting was an oathing ceremony, which those who remember the war will still reenact today. It was like a declaration of allegiance to the crown.
I speak the truth and vow before our God and by this Betuni oath and our movement, which is called the movement of fighting, that if I'm called on to kill for our soil and to shed my blood for it, I shall obey and I shall never surrender. I speak the truth and vow before our God that if the people of the movement come to me by day or night, and if they ask me to hide them, I shall do so and I shall help them. And if I fail to do these things, may this oath kill me.
It was a rural war, fought around the European farms, mainly by landless peasants and the urban jobless. The Kikuyu themselves were divided. Brother killed brother. Only gradually did the revolt turn into a bid for national independence. Thousands were interned. Hundreds were hanged for alleged terrorism. In the end, less than 100 whites were killed, but at least 40,000 Africans died as a result of the war. Legitimate African aspirations were met with degradation and death. It was a pattern repeated all over settler Africa. There was one Kenyan who symbolized the clash between Africa and the West, Jomo Kenyatta. The whites hated him, regarding him as the evil genius of terrorism, and they locked him up as the alleged founding father of Mau Mau. But he survived, part of the long tradition of African nationalists who have been imprisoned. He'd spent many years in England before returning to sound the clarion call of liberation. It was he who led Kenya to independence. The secret of building a nation is to know what to forget. You need a selective memory. It's almost like marriage. If the two partners keep on remembering every unkind word they've ever uttered to each other, the marriage might well be doomed. Well, it's reasoning like that which was probably in Kenyatta's mind when he arrived at this hotel to address a meeting of whites. You see, they had abused him. They had called him leader unto darkness and death. They had imprisoned him for nearly 10 years. As Kenyatta stepped into the hotel, the question arose, was his memory capable of being selective?
If you want to understand one another, the best thing is to talk together, to exchange views. This is my belief. We must also learn how to forgive one another. We are not angels, we are human beings. And as such, we are bound to make mistakes. If I have done mistakes to you, it's for you to forgive me. If you have done to me, I say it's for me to forgive you. We want you to cooperate with us so that we can work together to make Kenya a suitable place for human beings to live in.
This is Somalia, the theater for a different conflict. Not black against white in the colonial period, but black against black in the post-colonial age. And yet, this new conflict has its origins in the imperial past, in the game of map-making which the white man played many years ago. Colonialism put together people who would otherwise have been separate. It also separated people who would otherwise have been together. The result has been confusion and sometimes conflict, even civil wars, interstate war, superpowers intervening. Most African countries are states trying hard to become nations. But a country like Somalia is in effect a nation trying to become an all-inclusive state. The partition of the old Somaliland was a painful microcosm of the partition of Africa. The Somali are scattered in 4 different countries: Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya, and the new Somalia, longing for reunification one day. Before the West arrived, there were virtually no boundaries. Most people lived in their loose groupings, unmarked territories. Empires came and went, absorbing other groups and being assimilated themselves. At the end of the last century came the colonial West, imposing the iron grid of division upon the continent. The partition was arbitrary. In West Africa, the large territory which the British had carved out and called Nigeria enclosed 3 major nations and several smaller ones. Among the larger groups, the Yoruba in the west were very different from the Muslim Hausa in the north, who in turn were quite distinct from the Igbo in the east. This artificial mixture was to lead to one of Africa's great human tragedies. Until pictures of starving Ethiopian children shocked the world in the 1980s, the most haunting images from post-colonial Africa were those of starving Biafran children in the Nigerian Civil War of 1967 to 1970. A drought, like lightning, is often an act of God. A civil war is an act of man. But which man? Who was the ultimate architect of the Biafran tragedy? When Britain's Lord Lugard amalgamated northern and southern Nigeria into one country in 1914, he kept Christian missionaries and their schools away from the Muslim north, while encouraging them in the non-Muslim south. It was a fateful decision that sowed the seeds of the Civil War 50 years later. Muslims were left to continue with their traditional education. A new cultural divide was in the making. Northern traditions were protected from the corrosive power of westernization. The Quran remained triumphant, but there was an economic cost.
No, in English.
As Nigeria found itself becoming a Western-style society, Northerners were at an increasing disadvantage.
Yes, how many? Is what? Okay, say it in English. Yeah?
Their traditional Islamic education left them unable to compete with those in the south.
Say it together.
The Igbo were all that the Hausa were not. Perhaps too ready to imitate the West, Igbo nonetheless took over many jobs in the north that Muslims were unwilling or unable to do. Artisans, craftsmen, and mechanics filled the northern void of skills, but that hasn't always endeared them to the locals. Some have described the Igbo as the Jews of Nigeria, far from home, coexisting with many cultures, geographically mobile, economically enterprising, intellectually ambitious, and quite often they prosper. Sometimes they prosper more than is safe for them. They say nothing succeeds like success, but there are times when nothing is more dangerous than success. That is the lesson that the Igbo learned in their own Holocaust, from the anti-Igbo riots of 1966 to the end of the Civil War. In January 1966, Nigeria had its first military coup. It was Igbo-led, and many believed they were out to add political supremacy to their economic preeminence. Prime Minister Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, a Hausa, was murdered. Also killed was the Sardauna of Sokoto, the North's supreme political leader. In revenge, the Hausa fell upon the Igbo. Hundreds of Igbo in the north were killed. Thousands fled back to Igbo land. The head of state, an Igbo, was murdered and replaced by a young colonel, Yakubu Gawan, a Christian from the north. The Igbo champion was another officer, Emeka Ojukwu. He refused to recognize Gawan and announced that the East was seceding from Nigeria.
If we are exterminated, our noble culture will disappear with us. I should say that the converse is equally true. If our culture were to disappear, we would lose the will and strength to resist the principalities and powers of darkness and wrong. We would lose our identity, self-respect, and dignity.
And so Biafra was born, and the war began. Reinforced by white mercenaries, Ojukwu's army was built around a nucleus of defectors from the Nigerian military.
Move on, come on, move on!
Despite lack of training and arms, they held out for 3 years. On the other side, the Federal Army grew into the largest in Black Africa. Their slogan was, "To keep Nigeria one is a task that must be done." Perhaps 1 million died. No one had time to count very closely. On the Biafran side, starvation claimed as many victims as the fighting. Much of the conflict was a bush war through lush Igbo territory, as each side sought to control the roads leading to the Biafran heartland and to a more material prize. Nigeria's worst disaster of the 20th century was indeed about territory and land, but as befits a conflict of the 20th century, it was also about industrial resources. The war was in part about petroleum. You see, Nigeria's oil was located in the eastern region. The Easterners found this a source of strength. It strengthened their decision to secede. Before long, freedom for Biafra was inseparable from fuel, and patriotism for the federal side could not be separated from petroleum. Oil was a central asset which might have made an independent Biafra viable. Radio Biafra exploited it to the full as a propaganda weapon.
Gawan wants Port Harcourt. He wants our oil wealth by all means and at all costs, but he cannot get it. Port Harcourt signifies our freedom. Port Harcourt signifies our resistance to barbarism, our faith in God, and our unflinching determination to survive.
Biafra did survive longer than expected, thanks to a regular airlift from outside. The motives were mixed: compassion, profit, some wanted the oil. The planes flew at night, running the gauntlet of the Federal Air Force. The relics of some of the planes still lie at what used to be the Uli airstrip in Biafra. Sometimes as many as 40 flights a night came in here. It may not look like it, but this Uli airstrip was part and parcel of the incredible internationalization of the Nigerian Civil War. The French backed Biafra, and their support came partly through this airport. The British backed the federal side. The Chinese backed Biafra, though more with words than with ammunition. The Israelis backed Biafra with some material support through here, while the Arabs, especially the Egyptians, backed the federal side. Perhaps the most interesting contrast concerned the two superpowers. The United States was embroiled in Vietnam and seemed disabled to take part in the Nigerian Civil War. On the other hand, the Soviet Union, though embroiled in Czechoslovakia in 1968, nevertheless was sufficiently interested in Nigeria to force Czechoslovakia to send jet fighters to Nigeria in the hope, in part, of destroying this airport. The politics of the world were played out at this little airstrip. It was the stamp of uniqueness about Nigeria's civil war, almost a global conflict in miniature. Internally, there was the fear that the rest of Nigeria would disintegrate with Biafra's secession. But in fact, most of the nation rallied behind Gawan's federal government. At last, in January 1970, the planes stopped bombing. The guns went silent. This market city of Onitsha has recovered much of its liveliness, almost as if the civil war had never occurred. You see, Nigeria's finest hour was not victory in war, it was magnanimity in triumph. Nigeria as a society has never been known for restraint, for discipline, for self-control, for sense of proportion. And yet, in that supreme hour of crisis, when the war was coming to an end and there was fear of large-scale revenge, Nigeria prayed for restraint and behold, found it.
We have fought a long, bitter battle, and it has ended in a victory for common sense, victory for the unity of this country.
Gawan receives the surrender of Biafra. The vanquished were not humiliated. The victors did not gloat. It was a proud moment in Africa's history.
How are you? Excellent. Glad to see you again. Thank you very much. Glad to see you again.
It's an experience.
Honestly. Glad to see you again.
Like Abraham Lincoln in America a century earlier, Yakubu Gawan had saved